And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. The newest entry in our continuing series, simply titled The Great Movies. And this is a film I am an enormous fan of, one of my favorite movies by top 5 greatest living filmmaker, and a film that has an enormous, immense rewatchability factor because the story is fun and the two lead actors are sublime. The filmmaker is Steven Spielberg. The movie is 2002's Catch Me If You Can. And since the movie has come out, there's a certain levels of irony, I should say, because the author of the book, a real-life con artist named Frank Abagnale Jr., it turns out that he probably fabricated a lot of the stuff that was in the book and a lot of the stuff that ended up in the movie. And a lot of people were angry, almost blaming Spielberg for the fact that, well, this is bullshit because none of this, or almost none of this really happened. Well, that's kind of the point, though, isn't it? The guy was a con artist. Frank Abagnale Jr. was basically a genius who just happened to be a con artist. He made up these elaborate schemes, some of which he pulled off in real life, but a lot of the stuff in the movie didn't happen in real life. But who cares? It's a movie. If somebody had asked me in 2002, what level of confidence do you have that all of this stuff actually happened in real life? I would have said somewhere between 0 and 0 degrees Kelvin, aka absolute zero. The fact that events in the movie, although inspired by true events, it's even a lower percentage of stuff in the film that happened in real life, but it doesn't matter because Spielberg gets maximum value from his entire cast, whether it's Christopher Walken as Frank Abagnale Sr., whether it's DiCaprio as Frank Abagnale Jr., whether it's Tom Hanks as Carl Hanratty. Everybody brings their A game. Amy Adams. It is a movie that was an enormous box office hit. The budget was somewhere between 50 and 55 million. It grossed between 350 and 355 worldwide. And again, time value of money. This is 22 plus years ago, so the number would be higher if it were released today. It was a massive hit. It got fantastic reviews. And this is a very ethereal concept that I'm going to throw at you. But for me, certain major stars, if you ask me, give me one role that sums up why. Why was this person such a big deal? What is the one role that we are going to remember? For example, when Brad Pitt takes the final bow, when Brad Pitt retires from film acting 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it doesn't matter. I believe that Brad Pitt will be most remembered as Tyler Durden. That when we think of Brad as he's coming to the end, we're going to think of him young. We're going to think of him on fire as Tyler Durden in Fight Club. I believe, even though he didn't win an Oscar, I don't think he was even nominated. We are going to remember Leonardo DiCaprio first and foremost for his turn as Frank Abagnale Jr. He was still in his 20s. It was a fantastic role, and he did not coast. He acts the hell out of this part. And he's enough of a talented performer. I understand he's a great-looking guy. I know, and we can make jokes about, the kind of Logan's Run aspect. If the girlfriend gets to a certain age, he replaces her. I know. But DiCaprio's performance in this film, it's kind of undersold just how good it is. If you notice the difference in body language, the difference in vocal inflections when Abagnale is a teenager versus as he gets older when he's pretending to be someone a lot older, Spielberg can draw that from his actors. But there has to be the wellspring of ability to even do that. And DiCaprio's performance in this film is as good as anything he's done. If you ask me, it's better than what he does in The Revenant, which is what he won his Oscar for. I say that this is his finest performance. He's great as Howard Hughes. 2 years later in Martin Scorsese's The Aviator. That's a film that should have won more Oscars than it did. And if Leo had won Best Actor for that over Jamie Foxx, I mean, Jamie Foxx is magnificent in Ray, but DiCaprio in The Aviator, another great performance, just showing the versatility that he has as a performer. So yeah, Catch Me If You Can is about a real life con artist who pulled the wool over a lot of people. And in the world of the movie, we just take the movie for what it is. He is running what amounts to a check kiting scheme that in the long pre-internet and when everything was kind of analog, there was very little that was digital. Computers existed, but you have something that the size, like something that's 2 inches now, is more powerful than a computer that was the size of a room. I'm not exaggerating with that. He pulled off years worth of schemes, or the character in the movie pulls off years worth of schemes. And it's up to the FBI, and one FBI agent in particular, to first figure out what this guy is doing. What's his deal? What does he look like? How can we catch him if he keeps changing his identity and keeps moving around? And a lot was made at the time of the film's release, and even people picking up the film a little bit later, as you go on YouTube and you see many of the movie reactors who hadn't seen this film, and talking about what a great dynamic Tom Hanks's Carl Hanratty has with Leonardo DiCaprio's Frank Abagnale Jr., even though they don't spend very much of the movie together. They spend almost, huge stretches of the film, they're apart. Well, how could they be together? One guy is chasing the other guy. But they have such a natural rapport, even in the phone conversations, and there feels like a connection, even though they're on opposite sides of the law. They're natural enemies, natural adversaries, but there is almost a kind of father-son dynamic that develops between them, which is right in the Spielberg wheelhouse, which makes it all the more kind of puzzling. Some of you know this, but some of you don't. Tom Hanks was not cast as Carl Hanratty. He was a last-second replacement for James Gandolfini. That's right. Tony Soprano himself was cast as Carl Hanratty. I don't know if he would have done the New England accent. That part I'm not sure of. The problem with Gandolfini, from the literal perspective, he had a narrow window within which they were going to shoot his scenes because The Sopranos, not surprisingly, was his priority. But Gandolfini was excited, and he gives a pretty good performance the previous year in the Robert Redford film, also with Mark Ruffalo, Last Castle. It's not great, but Gandolfini in that film takes the time to craft almost a three-dimensional villainous performance, but this is not a Tony Soprano type villain. This is a guy who is in a position of power that really shouldn't be in a position of power. And it's Robert Redford's movie. But Gandolfini, as much as his character is really unlikable, it's a very solid, careful performance I really like. And I think that film is kind of underrated for whatever that's worth. Redford went back to work a lot in that era. He did Spy Game with Brad Pitt right around that same time. But the issue with Gandolfini, they only had maybe a month or so with which they were going to be able to shoot all of the scenes with Carl Hanratty, and it didn't seem to be a problem except for the fact that DiCaprio had finished filming Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. And as they were getting ready to shoot Catch Me If You Can, they were not far away from the first day of shooting. Spielberg got a call from his old buddy, Scorsese, and Martin said, I hope I don't fuck anything up, but I'm going to need the kid back. I got to use him. I'm going to probably need a couple of weeks. Is that going to fuck things up for you? Or words to that effect. Nobody knows what was actually said, but something like what I just put out there is what happened. So DiCaprio went back to Italy, to the studio, Cinecittà? I don't even know how it's pronounced. Cinecitta Studios. And he went there, and I think that he may have gone somewhere else, but the idea was he was gone too long. They were running up against a brick wall of when Gandolfini was going to have to bail anyway. So Gandolfini bowed out. And then it's a question of, okay, when Leo comes back, who's going to play Carl Hanratty? So Spielberg called Tom Hanks, literally called him, And he explained, we're in big trouble here, pal. We're in big trouble. They had worked together, I think, on From the Earth to the Moon after Saving Private Ryan, just for reference. So the guys were friends. They worked together, but it wasn't just a professional relationship. They considered each other friends. So Spielberg more or less cajoled, begged, pleaded, Tom, is there any version of reality in which we can get a little bit of your time, because we're in a fix. We have to have somebody of status, of stature. I thought Gandolfini was going to work out, but Marty needed him. What are you going to do? It's the movie business, right? So Hanks told Spielberg, given what his schedule was at that time, he was, I don't know if he was deep into Road to Perdition. Like that part, I don't know, but he was working. He had a little bit of time. He told Spielberg, I can give you maybe 10 days, maybe 10 days. So the genius of Spielberg, and I don't know how he pulled this off, because when you think of, and if you were to watch the movie after this episode, you would not think that all of Tom Hanks' scenes were shot over an 8-day stretch. Now, when I found that out, my first instinct was, that's not right. That is bullshit. But it's apparently true. They figured out how to get all the locations that were necessary, and DiCaprio, whoever, Christopher Walken, was involved in the scenes with Hanks. The actress who plays the mother, I don't remember her name. They figured out a way to line it all up, and Hanks, they all hit their marks. 8 days. That's it. All of Carl Hanratty's scenes. I can't even imagine the schedules. They were probably working 20-hour days, but they got it done. And Hanks, he had one weekend to try to master that kind of tricky New England accent. And I think he crushes it. You want to hear me tell a joke? Knock, knock. Who's there? Go fuck yourselves. Absolute gold. Now, Hanks's performance, although that's one moment where he gets a laugh, it is a very straightforward, it is a serious performance. Carl Hanratty is not, as much as the kid puts one over on him and Abagnale Jr. is always fucking with him, he is a serious guy. We are supposed to take him seriously. He is presented as highly competent. And his associates, the guys that he's working with, they have a few laughs early, but they are also serious people. The film has a lighthearted tone. It has a lightness of touch and a kind of, it has a spirit to it. It's difficult to classify. The movie is kind of a comedy thriller, a comedy action film. In a way, it's almost a buddy movie, despite the fact that the buddies, in this case, are on opposite sides of the law, and they're not working together. They're working against each other, but then, spoiler alert, maybe there will be a pathway for them to actually work together at some point. And the film is, not surprisingly, because it is pretty long, it's over 2 hours, it just moves so quickly, and it doesn't feel rushed. Spielberg allows the scenes to develop, even in the early going, because you get the feeling that he really wants to get the story proper when Abagnale's schemes really begin. He wants to get it moving, but he's still patient in the early scenes, showing the family seemingly together. And Christopher Walken as the dad is really, really great. And there was a short that I saw on YouTube recently. I had not seen this footage, where there's a scene in the film, this is not a spoiler, where Christopher Walken as Frank Sr. is having lunch with his son, who has already started making a shit ton of money. He pretty much is full. He's lying to his dad. This is what I'm doing. He doesn't say, Dad, by the way, I've made $1 million in fake checks. But Christopher Walken made an actor decision in the moment. And Spielberg isn't necessarily opposed to ad-libbing, but I don't think that he's somebody who encourages just do whatever you want. But Walken did something in the scene where he hesitated, he paused, he was kind of known for this, but not the way he does it here. He kind of starts to cry, and when the scene is over, this was the short, Spielberg was crying. And everybody who witnessed this was emotional. It's probably the scene that got Walken the Best Supporting Actor nomination. He didn't end up winning, but he is an actor that can kind of cut both ways. Sometimes he's a little bit overwrought, as in True Romance. But when he's cast and when the director gives him the room to kind of do the scene, but if you want to try something else, like Walken had obviously enough respect where Spielberg wasn't going to bark at him. Just read the lines. Like the story that Josh Brolin just told when he was on the set of The Goonies, and he asked Spielberg, who was the coordinating producer, the executive producer, as Richard Donner directed the film, but he said, Mr. Spielberg, may I speak to you about this scene here? Yeah, of course, kid. And remember, Spielberg was known as somebody who was really good with child actors because he was a kid at heart and he has enormous patience. And so Josh Brolin tells the story. I'm sitting there for 20 minutes explaining to Steven what I wanted to do with this one scene when we're kind of going through a tunnel. And I'm talking, and he's paying attention to me, and he's nodding his head, and he's like, I like this, Josh. And he's kind of almost glad-handing him. And Brolin gets to the end of his spiel where he says, this is what I would like to do. But it takes him 15 minutes to tell that story to Spielberg. And then at the end of Brolin's spiel, Spielberg goes, Josh, maybe just try reading the lines in the script. So as much as you could talk to Steven Spielberg, and he's going to nod his head and say, wow, what great ideas you have, if he doesn't like it, he's not just going to automatically go for it. Christopher Walken did this scene, and it was a home run, and it ended up being in the movie. But the confidence of the production, because it almost looks like a bigger budget than it actually was, the way they redress the sets. For example, there are scenes in New York City, and this is the kind of stuff that I really like. Just in general, I enjoy movies, 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, set in Manhattan. But what this movie does, because it's not set in the Manhattan of the present day, there are certain buildings, there are certain kind of geographical markers that had to be redressed for the time. And, for example, what is now the MetLife building, it was the Pan Am building back then. And, well, that's what you see in the movie. They redressed that famous, I don't know what street they start at, but you turn your head to the right, and there is the Pan Am building in the world of this film. And it's not a coincidence. He's an airline pilot, like anything to do with Pan Am. And then, obviously, DiCaprio playing Howard Hughes in The Aviator. There's airline pilots, airplanes in both movies. They play major roles just in different ways. The thing that I always take away from this film is the whimsy and the fact that Frank Abagnale was not a violent criminal. If it would be possible for him to just get the money and nobody ever get hurt, that was his angle, at least in the world of the film. That was his process. He didn't want to hurt anybody. And it is very Spielbergian. I can't imagine any other filmmaker making the movie. You could imagine somebody else making it, but not the way that he did. The fact that Frank Abagnale Jr.'s entire modus operandi here is he wants to get his parents back together. This is another Spielberg film about the breakdown of the nuclear family and or a boy searching for his mom. Like, none of this is an accident. Each great filmmaker, you can point to certain hallmarks of their work. And Spielberg is a great filmmaker. And I'm glad that he is. It's so crazy to imagine. When I was in film school, there were people who didn't take him seriously. We're talking serious academics that thought, now he's pretty much of a lightweight. Fuck you. Going back to the mid-90s, I was fighting back against the idea that he was not a peer of the master filmmakers. Don't tell me that he's not on the level. He is, already 30 years ago. The technical proficiency, just like they used to talk about Hitchcock until Robin Wood kind of reappraised him and said, this guy is a peer of Wells. He's a peer of Ford. He's a peer of Kurosawa. Don't tell us that Hitchcock is just a brilliant technician. Don't tell me that Spielberg is just really good behind the camera. He knows how to frame action. No, he may not speak like a guy with a 180 IQ, but that doesn't make him any less of a filmmaking genius. And the things that preoccupied Spielberg are not the same things that preoccupied his pal Kubrick or his lifelong almost buddy Scorsese or De Palma or Coppola. What were some of the things that Stanley Kubrick was obsessed with? He was obsessed with the concept of dehumanization, of man dehumanizing other man. Paths of Glory, Full Metal Jacket, Clockwork Orange. Do we think that it was an accident that Kubrick made those movies? It was not. Martin Scorsese, themes of Catholic guilt, caste systems within societies. He was obsessed with it. He was also obsessed with the role of the media. Think about Taxi Driver, way ahead of its time. Scorsese would not have made Catch Me If You Can. It's not the kind of story that he would have sparked to. I don't think that Spielberg would have ever made a movie like Taxi Driver. I don't think he would have thought in terms of making a movie like Goodfellas. Now, what was fascinating in Spielberg's career right around this time, his previous movie was AI, which had been Kubrick's project. And Kubrick couldn't get it off the ground because it was going to cost too much money. And the studio, as much as they loved Stanley, he hadn't made, Eyes Wide Shut had made money. As we know, he passed. But he was trying to mount AI earlier in the 90s. He punted the Aryan Papers because he felt it was too close to Schindler's List. And AI in the mid-90s, I thought was going to cost $200 million. But that movie, as much as there is the concept that Kubrick was obsessed with of technology taking over, and what if we live in a world where the robots have more human qualities than the humans? 2001: A Space Odyssey. Well, AI gets into that. But Kubrick ultimately, when he passed the project to Spielberg, said, I think that this is closer to your sensibilities, Steven. And Spielberg made AI, and arguably it's one of the best films he's ever made. It's a movie that really makes you think. It really makes you question, what does it mean to be human? It is as good of a science fiction film as has come out of Hollywood in the last 5 decades. I'll stand on that one. That's a hill I'll go down on. It doesn't feel very Spielbergian. It feels austere. It feels cold, like a Kubrick film. Although a lot of people would argue many of Kubrick's films are steeped in humanity. It's really a matter of how you look at it. But that's the Spielberg who made Catch Me If You Can. He wasn't quite as pessimistic as he would become in films like Munich and, War of the Worlds. That is a very pessimistic film, regardless of how the last 5 minutes go. And the thing that I love about assessing careers of filmmakers is you can see evolution, you can see de-evolution, you can see progression, you can see regression. In the career of Steven Spielberg, there are movies that are angry and pessimistic movies, and in some cases, he mirrored what he was going through. He talked about how Temple of Doom, he was not doing great on a personal level. And I understand he was already incalculably wealthy and unbelievably respected. He was still in his 30s. I know that. But he was going through a divorce. He was not having a great time while he was making Temple of Doom. And the film was darker than the Spielberg of later era would make. And when he was preparing War of the Worlds, everyone was still reeling from 9/11. That is a 9/11 alien movie. It is not accidental, some of the images in that film. Spielberg was still reeling, and he poured it into his work. But Catch Me If You Can, there is still the joy. There is still the lightness of touch of some of his earlier works. Close Encounters of the Third Kind is an alien movie where, spoiler alert, the aliens aren't trying to kill us necessarily. They're just curious. As when we explore into space, we're curious. Catch Me If You Can has that sense of wonder. The joy of going to the movies, of being in the cinema. That was a great movie to see in theaters. And it was just meant to be that Tom Hanks. It's not that Gandolfini couldn't have played that role, but the father-son angle that Spielberg clearly wanted to emphasize. You're not going to have it with Gandolfini because of the Tony Soprano identification. He's a more menacing, intimidating actor. Now, Gandolfini could have made it work, but I just don't think the film would have been as good. And getting Martin Sheen to play Amy Adams' father, what a great performance by him, where you're not sure exactly at what point does he really know this guy's full of shit. He's not a doctor and at least a kid. It's the strength of Sheen's performance, the way that he handles when the FBI comes to his house. It's a kind of role that a different era Martin Sheen may have overacted it a little bit, but he is right on the numbers there. It is a great performance. And the costumes are so good. The use of music, John Williams' score. Talk about an incredible talent. John Williams, so many memorable scores. This one with that kind of tinkly, and the title sequence inspired by the great Saul Bass, who had worked with Hitchcock. If you were to do a little bit of a experiment, because there is a North by Northwest element in this film, the way that Frank Abagnale is chased around the country, compare the title sequence of Catch Me If You Can with North by Northwest. There are parallels. It is not an accident the way that they lay out the title sequence in this film. It is very much paying homage to Saul Bass and to North by Northwest. The stories do have that kind of lightness of touch, although Roger O. Thornhill is not a criminal. They think he's a criminal. They think he's a spy. They think maybe he's a double agent. He's a Madison Avenue advertising executive. He's got 2 ex-wives and several bartenders who depend on him. He doesn't want to disappoint any of them by getting slightly killed. Catch Me If You Can is a great entertainment. And when I think of Spielberg, I have this in my Spielberg top 5. It's not easy. My favorite DiCaprio performance, it's in my Spielberg top 5, which is really saying something. Think about how many great movies he made. There are movies not in his top 10 for me, such as West Side Story, which are awesome. I mean, West Side Story, what an incredible film that was. But he's made so many great movies. There's just not enough room. But Hanks's performance, not Oscar nominated, at least I don't think. He's amazing. 3 Days Notice, learning that accent, knocking it out of the park. And there is a little bit of the sadness because the fact, mild spoiler, Frank's quest ultimately fails. But the Frank Abagnale Jr. of the movie is so... He has a certain weird charisma. That's one of the reasons why he was able to, pull off the scams that he did throughout the film, because people wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe that this crazy kid is exactly who and what he says he is. And we as the audience, we're with him every step of the way. We're not condoning all of the theft and all of the crime, but he's so likable. He doesn't really want anybody to get hurt. And DiCaprio, the performance never wavers, it never lags. The way that you could see him, the gears turning and calculating within scenes, it's just a great performance. Everyone in the movie brings their A game. And the set design, the production design, and just the spirit of everybody in the cast, they all just knock it out of the park. It's a home run. I think this movie is a 10 out of 10. And it's similar to The Truman Show in the sense, and I've mentioned this, The Truman Show is a movie that was an enormous box office hit. It got almost across the board rave reviews. But I still feel like it's underrated. Because you could say, oh yeah, this movie is terrific. I don't think that The Truman Show is as critically praised as it possibly could be. And I feel like Catch Me If You Can, yeah, it's a great entertainment, but I think it's just simply a phenomenal motion picture. It's not just an 8 out of 10, breezy, great entertainment. There is more to chew on here. This rises to the level of a truly great film. Catch Me If You Can, from 2002, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Tom Hanks, Martin Sheen, and Christopher Walken. The newest entry in our continuing series of the great movies. This has been episode 438 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Monday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.